You know that classic American hero? The larger-than-life sheriff who fought the mob, inspired the movie Walking Tall, and became a legend? The guy who stood tall for justice even after his wife, Pauline, was tragically killed in a brutal mob ambush? We all know that story. Well, get ready, because that entire story is a lie. The heroic ambush that launched a Hollywood franchise? It was staged. The mob didn't kill his wife. Just recently, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation announced that after 57 years, they finally know the truth. And the evidence, they say, points to one person as the killer, the hero sheriff himself, Buford Pusser. Now, I know that sounds absolutely insane, but this isn't just a rumor. This is the result of a modern cold case investigation, an exhumation of Pauline's body, and the incredible power of forensic science that simply didn't exist back then. And in this video, we're going to break down exactly how this 57-year-old lie was finally shattered. We'll look at the blood spatter evidence that makes his story impossible, the secret behind his own gunshot wound that made him a victim, and the chilling theories about why a man would murder his wife just to build his own legend. This is the real story of Walking Tall, and trust me, you're going to want to see this. All right, so to understand how this lie got so big, we first have to build the legend, exactly as the world knew it for more than half a century. And it all starts with one man, Buford Hayes Pusser. This guy was straight out of a comic book. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, a giant of a man who was a standout in high school sports. His early life was a search for an identity big enough to match his frame. After a short stint in the Marines that ended due to asthma, he found his calling in the wrestling ring in Chicago, where he became the performer known as Buford the Bull. This is a key detail, because wrestling taught him not just how to fight, but how to create a persona, how to sell an image of intimidating strength to a crowd. When he came back home to Tennessee, he followed his father into law enforcement, first as a police chief, and then in 1964 as the youngest sheriff in the state's history. He ran on a single powerful promise to wage a one-man war on the crime and corruption plaguing the area, and his methods were direct. He became famous as a hard-nosed, no-nonsense law officer who settled disputes with a large homemade bat. His time as sheriff was a blur of violence. He was shot 8 times and stabbed 7 times. He was a force of nature, and his reputation was built on this larger-than-life, almost cartoonish masculinity. But every great hero needs a great villain. And Buford Pusser had a real one, the State Line Mob. This wasn't some made-up bad guy for the movies. The mob was a very real and very dangerous criminal syndicate that basically ran the Tennessee-Mississippi border in the 50s and 60s. Their business was vice, bootlegging, illegal gambling, prostitution, robbery, and even murder. And they were making hundreds of thousands of dollars from their network of corrupt clubs and motels. Pusser went right after them. In his first year as sheriff, he raided 42 illegal stills and arrested 75 moonshiners, hitting the mob directly in their wallet. So the conflict was real. The mob was violent, and everyone knew they wanted Sheriff Pusser dead. This created the perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. In a strange way, Pusser needed the mob. Their very real threat gave his legend the raw material it needed to grow. Which brings us to the pre-dawn hours of August 12, 1967. According to Buford's one and only account, the night began with a phone call around 4:30 a.m. reporting a disturbance on New Hope Road. His wife, Pauline, was worried for his safety after previous attempts on his life, and she insisted on going with him. As they drove down that dark, rural road, a car that had been following them suddenly sped up and pulled alongside. A hail of bullets erupted from a .30 caliber carbine, shattering the windows of their car. Pauline was struck in the head. Pusser floored it, trying to escape. He sped down the road for about 2 miles before stopping to check on his wife. That's when the assailant's car returned and opened fire again. This time, a bullet hit Pauline a second time, and another one ripped through Buford's jaw, shattering it. When help finally arrived, the scene was gruesome. The sheriff was slumped over the wheel, horribly wounded. And his wife, Pauline, was lying across the seat with her head in his lap. She was dead, The story was set in stone. A heroic sheriff and his wife, ambushed by the very evil he had sworn to destroy. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the foundational tragedy that would eventually be immortalized in the 1973 classic film Walking Tall. But even from the very beginning, if you look past the legend, you can see the cracks. The initial investigation into Pauline's murder was, to put it lightly, a disaster. The entire case, as the TBI director would later admit, was built largely on his own statement and closed quickly. Everything they knew, the description of the car, the motive of a mob hit, it all came from a single witness who was also a victim and the county's top cop. But here's the most critical failure, the one that allowed a lie to live for 57 years. They never performed an autopsy on Pauline Pusser's body. That's just unbelievable by today's standards. It meant that the real evidence, the bullet trajectories, the range from which they were fired, any other signs of a struggle, was never examined. It was buried with her. Investigators at the scene basically had confirmation bias. They knew about Pusser's war with the mob, so when he said it was a mob ambush, it just made sense. It was the story everyone expected to hear. This wasn't just a failure of forensics. It was a failure of culture. The police weren't investigating a crime scene. They were helping a fellow officer, a hero who had just been attacked. This professional deference, an early example of the blue wall of silence, let Buford Pusser control the entire investigation into his own wife's murder. And then there was Pauline herself. For decades, she was just a tragic footnote in her husband's story. But she was a person of substance and strength. Before she married Buford, she was a divorcee with 2 children. She had a life completely independent of the man who would define her death. The most powerful account of her character comes from her younger brother, Griffin Mullins. He described her as a people person and sweet, saying, "You would fall in love with her." But more importantly, he called her the leader of the family, the person everyone turned to for advice. This image of a strong, capable woman stands in stark contrast to Buford's persona, which was all about absolute dominance. In a marriage with a man like that, her strength might not have been seen as a good thing, but as a challenge. And behind the scenes, the marriage was in trouble. Her brother admitted that while Pauline didn't talk about her problems, he knew deep down there were problems in her marriage. It's a quiet but telling statement that hinted at a darkness inside the Pusser home long before the official story ever fell apart. For 57 years, the questions and doubts about that morning on New Hope Road were just whispers. But that all changed in 2022 when the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officially initiated a review of Pauline Pusser's cold case file. A new tip in 2023 accelerated everything, leading investigators to a startling discovery. The file confirmed that no autopsy had ever been performed on Pauline. With the support of Pauline's surviving family, TBI agents oversaw the exhumation of her remains from the Adamsville Cemetery. On February 8, 2024, for the first time, Pauline's body would be examined by forensic experts, and the truth, buried for over half a century, was about to be brought into the light. On August 29, 2025, a date that will now live in Tennessee history, the TBI held a press conference. The conclusion they announced was a bombshell that shattered a national myth. They had found sufficient evidence to establish probable cause that, were he still alive, Buford Pusser would be charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Pauline. So how did they do it? How did they solve a 57-year-old murder? They let the science speak, and it systematically dismantled Buford's story, piece by piece. First, blood spatter analysis. In the story Buford told, all the violence happened inside the car during a drive-by shooting. But forensic analysis found blood spatter on the exterior hood of the vehicle. This is one of the most damning pieces of physical evidence. Spatter on the hood means a bleeding person was outside and in front of the car, which is completely inconsistent with an ambush from a passing vehicle. Next, the wounds themselves. Medical examiners concluded that Pauline was shot outside the car and then moved inside after she was killed. The evidence for this was in her injuries. The cranial trauma she suffered was inconsistent with the physical state of the car's interior where she was found. In simple terms, the damage to her head didn't match the lack of corresponding damage inside the car. Then there's Buford's famous injury, the shattered jaw that made him a sympathetic hero. Forensic analysis revealed his gunshot wound was a close contact wound. A close contact wound has telltale signs, like powder burns, that can only happen when a gun is fired very close to the skin. A shot fired from a passing car, as he claimed, would be a long-range wound. The evidence strongly suggests his wound was self-inflicted as part of the staging. But the autopsy revealed one more secret, a silent testament to a hidden history of violence. Examiners discovered a healed nasal fracture, indicating a broken nose that had healed long before her death. This physical evidence corroborates the whispers from her brother that there was trouble in the marriage, reframing the murder not as a random act of mob violence, but as the horrifying culmination of a pattern of domestic abuse. So, with the what and the how established by science, the final, haunting question is why? Why would a man who had everything to lose commit such a brutal act and stage such an elaborate cover-up? The evidence suggests a few chilling possibilities. The most direct theory is that this was the final act in a long pattern of domestic violence. The healed nose bone is the physical proof. Buford Pusser was a man whose entire public identity was built on absolute physical dominance. It's plausible that an argument at home escalated, and in a fit of rage, he murdered her to maintain his sense of ultimate control. The elaborate cover story was then a desperate, cunning invention to hide a common, brutal crime by blaming his famous enemies. A colder, more narcissistic motive is that the murder was premeditated, a calculated step in building his own legend. From his wrestling days, Pusser knew the power of performance and a good backstory. He was already a local hero, but becoming the tragic widower whose wife was killed by the mob would elevate him to a national icon and a martyr. In this scenario, he didn't just kill Pauline in a rage. He used her as a pawn in his ambition, murdering her to create the perfect myth that would guarantee his fame. But there's one more theory, a unique and deeply unsettling one that seems to connect all the dots. Pauline Pusser was murdered because she discovered her husband was corrupt and threatened to expose him. Think about it. The state line mob was making a fortune. It's plausible that instead of just fighting them, Pusser was also co-opted by them. His very public war on crime could have been a performance, a way to eliminate rival criminals while protecting and profiting from the main syndicate. If Pauline, the intelligent leader of the family, discovered evidence of this unexplained cash or a secret ledger, she would not have stayed silent. She would have confronted him. For Buford, this was a threat to his very existence. Exposure wouldn't just mean prison. It would mean the total destruction of the heroic identity he had so carefully constructed. Her murder, therefore, was a calculated execution to silence the only witness who could destroy him. And the staged ambush was a masterstroke. It eliminated the threat, gave him a perfect alibi, making him a victim, and massively amplified the very heroic legend she threatened to shatter, making him untouchable. The weight of modern forensic evidence has collapsed a 57-year-old legend. The story of Buford Pusser, the heroic sheriff of Walking Tall, has been irrevocably replaced by the story of a man who murdered his wife and staged a crime scene to become a hero. This is a difficult truth, especially for a community built around his legacy and for those who grew up admiring the cinematic hero. But as District Attorney Mark Davidson stated so powerfully, this case is not about tearing down a legend. It is about giving dignity and closure to Pauline and her family, and ensuring that the truth is not buried with time. The truth matters. Justice matters. Even 58 years later, Pauline deserves both. In the end, this story is no longer about the fall of a flawed hero. It is about the long-delayed triumph of a victim. For nearly 6 decades, Pauline Mullins Pusser was just a supporting character in her husband's story. Now, thanks to the persistence of investigators and the unassailable logic of science, her own story can finally be told. It is the story of a strong woman, a family leader, and a victim of domestic violence whose truth was finally exhumed from the earth and brought into the light. The final word belongs not to the legend, but to the evidence that speaks for her. If you like this video and want to see more mysteries, please hit that like and subscribe button.